Good afternoon, all. I'm Amilcar Peter Sanatan, and it is a pleasure to deliver a presentation on decolonizing development in the region. Today, I focus on the significance of depatriarchal politics for development justice in the Caribbean. I want to trouble the notion that Caribbean states are committed to advancing gender equality in national development. The mandate of national gender machineries and policies, strategic action plans, and Sustainable Development Goal 5 of the 2030 UN SDGs in all of government and all of society. I extend this challenge to decolonization advocates, including in the reparations movement. We cannot add women and still for reparatory justice. This means we need to rethink gender parity in political leadership and representation, gender equality in mobility and management of public spaces, the need to end legislative and social homophobias, promoting healthy gender beliefs about peoples, identifying men's vulnerabilities, supporting them, while we enhance women's agency and autonomy. So the questions that we really probe is, who is the development subject? What definition of the citizen we mobilize in Caribbean development? And how is masculinity organized in Caribbean development? To make my argument clear, there is no decolonization without depatriarchalization. Gender is not a subcategory of analysis. It is front and center in the matrix of relations to understand the social, political, cultural, spatial, and economic exclusions, but also the possibilities for Caribbean freedom. So for the purpose of this presentation, I speak from the standpoint of a social organizer activist based in the Caribbean. In my experience, the major shortcoming of men's organizing is men's failure to confront and challenge male privilege. While there are positive signs of changing social relations of gender that allow men in some contexts to challenge gender stereotypes, enhance their role for care in the household, challenge traditional gender ideals, but we could see there are some persistence and unchanging ideals at stake. Gender equality work with men generally interrogates men's beliefs about gender, women's rights, and feminism. Men's relation to gender equality is even more complex theoretically and politically. In spite of the record of men as allies to women and support for gender equality in the past, there is a resistance to the changes that have happened in the Caribbean. Perhaps inadvertently, the political project of gender equality has appeared to reconfigure the face of our world, positioning more women in dominant roles previously held by men. Or maybe these young men believe that they are out of the dark ages of women's rights, activism, and women's studies, and in the new enlightenment of gender. A very politically defunct category, I say, but that doesn't have to account to women's lives. That is this gender confusion of our time. But this gender confusion is not simply a disorientation of men's minds, right? We are in a period of masculinist backlash. And some scholars have preferred to frame the issue as a frontal assault on women's rights, equality, and agency. And I identified kind of three axes in which this happens. One, the perceived marginalization of males, which has created a political climate where men's pains and concerns are reified, legitimated, and prioritized by women and men. Secondly, the language of male marginalization, the language itself, it deflects from understanding male engagement in the social and economic sectors. And third, male marginalization is fundamentally rooted in masculinist backlash politics, which is at the nexus of gender-based violence and men's control of women's bodies and autonomy. So in spite of this, the structural problem, patriarchy persists and binds men by the privileges it offers them. Thus, it occurred to me that all feminism, politics of social change, and decolonization must be depatriarchal in breaking that system that builds male dominance and its recent gendered accommodations. I start to reflect on the complexity of social life and the environments, which make it even hard for men to imagine committing to gender equality. And I ask myself, what do we want from Caribbean men? You know, it's real basic questions we have to kind of do in political work. What do we want from Caribbean men? Do we want small and micro changes of individuals for gender equal consciousness? Or do we want big structural changes to dismantle patriarchy? What does that project begin to look like? And my experiences have revealed to me that retraining men on male privilege and patriarchal dominance are central not only to boys and men's young men's subordination of women, but for their survival and negotiations in hegemonic male spaces. I draw on insights from extensive focus groups with young men in 2017, male perpetrator studies for a project supported by UN Women in the same year, and community-based organizing in an urban community in East Port of Spain, what is typically referred to as a marginalized area hotspot in the popular vernacular between 2018 to 2022. Gender equal awareness and actions are fine until it is complicated by violence. When we look at the abuse in childhood, neglect, dejection by parents, even the women who make demands of their sons to meet these patriarchal ideals, as well as male relations and spaces which constitutes boys and men's lives. Violence is a real issue. Big man thing, why empower individual men to be gender equal conscious in a patriarchal social environment that disempowers them daily? What change does it make in the lives of Caribbean men? So at this time, Caribbean governments are grappling with men's issues in national and regional development, and identify just 4 select areas I'd like to draw your attention to, which we could discuss in more detail in the Q&A. One is masculinity and its relationship to gangs and the use of small arms. Public insecurity in the Caribbean is not only a result of geopolitical dynamics and narco-trafficking. Young men are primarily the drivers of violent crimes and homicides with the use of guns, and they are also its largest victims. Yet, the regional public health approach adopted by the heads of government in the CARICOM in April 2023 does not adequately mainstream the gender perspective in its approach and commitments. Second, we have masculinity and the entrenchment of gender-based violence during the COVID-19 pandemic and post-pandemic. So let's look at some pre-pandemic dimensions. In a regional study, the prevalence of IPV against women, nearly 1 out of 2 ever partnered women between the ages of 15 to 64 experienced one or more forms of intimate partner violence in their lifetime. That's physical, sexual, psychological, and economic violence. 14% cited experiences of one or more forms of violence, such as physical, sexual, and psychological violence by their intimate partners. The report notes that the rates of IPV vary across the region: 55% in Guyana, 48% in Suriname, 44% in Trinidad and Tobago, 39% in Grenada and Jamaica. The COVID-19 pandemic presented several challenges to organizations and governments around the world responding to victims and their journey to survivorship. The shadow pandemic saw the increase in violence against women and girls. 45% of the women reported that they or a woman they know has experienced a form of violence against women since COVID-19. 65% of women reported experiencing a form of violence in their lifetime. In Trinidad and Tobago, 44% of ever partnered women experience a form of violence in their lifetime. And this is not an abstract conversation for us. We really have a focus on the youth-child gender nexus of development, because we see that 92% of the reports of sexual violence are by young women between under the ages of 35. So the COVID-19, it really entrenched this phenomenon of gender-based violence, which we were historically challenged with. And in our love for the rearview mirror of that pandemic, I don't think we have invested the quality of fiscal resources as well as the policy space to redress gender-based violence. Third issue is remasculinization of public space, which I would like to alert people to. Due to an increase in crime and violence, I'm seeing this in countries like Jamaica, in Guyana, and Trinidad and Tobago, and Belize as well. Public buildings and spaces are not exempt from attack and pillaging, as of course, bandits will overrun a building. But there's a shift happening in state-led community development centers to transform communal buildings and spaces run by community groups and women into state security managed spaces. And this has brought about police posts in community centers, the appropriation of community programs for residential youth programs run by the military, and the assertion of state security as community brokers over representative bodies of residents. These projects are also tied to kind of restoring masculinity. You know, I was asked, can men grow on trees? You know, they always say, we need more men. Like if we see more men will grow, right? But it also reasserts narrow definitions of manhood, rooted in colonial constructs of the gentleman, religious conservatism, the male breadwinner, and compulsory heterosexuality. Fourth point, final one I'll raise, is the mobilization of male marginalization discourse in political parties and civil society organizations. I'm talking about male-led organizations, faith-based groups, and increasingly by women in community action groups. And in the Q&A, I'm open to discussing this in more detail. So social organizing in the Caribbean needs to embrace a more liberating Caribbean creative imagination about development. SDG 5, National Gender Policy, and pats on the back that we can look at the COVID-19 pandemic in the rear view are politically empty if we do not urgently address patriarchal masculinities in Caribbean development. The violence in the Caribbean entrenches patriarchy. I know we like to transform attitudes and do behavior change. Patriarchal practices are rational where violence is omnipresent. And I think that is what I'm really trying to submit as well. So it is a larger peace-building initiative we also need to embrace in Caribbean societies. An organized depatriarchal movement of women and men in all their diversity. It sees people are fundamental to the prospect of transformative Caribbean development and freedom. The system of oppression and socioeconomic inequalities are deeply rooted in racial, class, and gendered sexualized histories, and indeed the historical oppression of women's bodies and resistance to their autonomy founded the social and economic order of Caribbean society. Depatriarchalization is not some concept, it's a beautiful word. It's a concept that really emerged from Latin American feminists and indigenous women's rights movements, where they said there was no decolonization possible without depatriarchalization. They themselves had an internal critique of the indigenous women's movement. I believe the Caribbean, particularly Anglophone Caribbean, being attentive to political current that exists right now, provides some political possibilities for us to advance the ongoing work that we have done with feminism, through feminism, but also beyond feminism, for the freedom of all Caribbean people. Thank you.